This is, as you might know, the third in our inaugural series of 3 Writers on Writing events. They've all been huge successes, and we are already busy planning next year. I cannot tell you anything about it officially yet, but if you are on the mailing lists for the Newbery and for StoryStudio, you will be among the first to know. This series is something that we dreamed up as a way to have writers engaging with other writers, talking about the craft of writing and about their history as writers rather than simply promoting one new book, which is often what you get at absolutely wonderful events at, say, a bookstore, but we wanted to be putting something else out there. And for this collaboration between a great library and a writing studio, this seemed like the perfect way to do it. So let me tell you, if you are not familiar with StoryStudio, you heard the pitch about the Newbery. I will tell you a little bit about StoryStudio. We are a 501c3 writing center, a center for the literary and creative writing arts. We are located physically in Ravenswood, right off the Brown line, but virtually everywhere. So those of you joining in from far away, you can take classes too. We have everything from fiction to poetry to memoir to screenplay to nonfiction. We offer classes for every age, from middle school to adult. And in fact, we have summer creative writing camps coming up, both in person and online, for middle schoolers and high schoolers, if you have one of those people in your lives. We offer classes for everyone from super beginner to super advanced, and every length of time, from one-night classes to year-long classes. You can pick up a bunch more information over there. There's stuff about the Newbery. There's also stuff about StoryStudio. One thing that I'm going to tell you about 2 specific things. One is that we have literally, I think, 2 tickets left. But we would love to see you if you're one of the people who wants those tickets to our annual fundraiser, Story Ball. We have a literary noir theme this year. It's at Revolution Brewing. We also, though, today just opened up our online auction, our online silent auction for that same event. You can bid on cool local things, tickets, basket of dog toys from local stores, but you can also bid on manuscript reviews from people like Lauren Groff or legendary copy editor Ben Dreyer, if you're a writer, and book club visits from a number of incredible authors. So look into that if you're interested. One other thing that's not on the slide, but there are cards over there, is that if you can't get enough Jericho Brown, and really no one can possibly get enough Jericho Brown, tomorrow morning he is doing a breakfast book club for StoryStudio at a trustee's home, and this will be your chance to talk to him about specifically his latest collection, The Tradition, anything else you want to ask him if you want that one-on-one time with him. There are still spots open, and this is a donation-based admission. So pick up the little flyer if you're interested. All right. On all of those notes, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our guests for the night. Jericho Brown is the author of 3 collections of poetry: The Tradition, a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award and winner of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry; The New Testament, which won the Anisfield-Wolf Book Award and was named one of the best of the year by just about absolutely everywhere; and Please, which won the 2009 American Book Award. He is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of English and Creative Writing at Emory University and director of the Creative Writing Program. Jericho does not remember the first time we met. I remember the first time we met, which was at the Breadloaf Writers Conference in about 2004 or 5, when I was a teeny tiny fiction writer scared out of my mind, and he was on the social staff serving drinks at the bar and getting the dancing started at parties, and made everyone so happy. And I was so stressed out, and then every time I saw his face, I smiled. We've seen each other since then, but that was our first encounter. Robyn Schiff, and let me say, I'm going to read her bio, and then I'm going to add something that is some news onto this bio. Robyn Schiff is the author of 3 poetry collections: Worth, Revolver, and A Woman of Property, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize, as well as the book-length poem Information Desk, an Epic, which was a finalist for this year's National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. The recipient of the 2023 Joseph Brodsky Rome Prize. Robyn is professor of English language and literature and director, just this past year joined us in Chicago as director of the program in creative writing at the University of Chicago. She co-edits Canarium Books. And on Monday, just casually, it was announced that she was a Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for this year, which is a really, really big deal. So this is a celebration of both of them. I can't wait to hear what they say. Thank you to all of you who braved the rain. I think there are people still out there braving the rain. I think they'll be joining us throughout. And I know we have a lot of people watching online as well. Welcome to all of you, and huge welcome to Robyn and Jericho.
Hi there. I was told to speak intimately to Jericho as if we were alone, but with a microphone. And thank you, Rebecca, and thank you so much to the Newberry for having us, and thank you to my students for coming. That's what makes me very happy. Hearing your story about meeting Jericho for the first time makes me think maybe I want to think back. I first met you. We worked together for 4 years, but we'd met previously to that. I think we met at an AWP first. My recollection is that Please had very recently come out. I had just given a very, I don't know what, stupid talk about Wall Stevens. You approached me afterward and asked me to come to your book signing, which was at the table for your first book. And I did, and I bought your book and read it, and discovered that you wrote something kind of sexy in it. Which I can't prove because these are not those copies. um, the second time I met you, I recall you proposing to me, which there were witnesses to. So that definitely happened. But then we worked together for several years at Emory, where Jericho ran an amazing, still runs an amazing program. But thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on your new books, these incredible
Thank you.
projects. I know this must have been in the introduction, but Jericho just edited the selected Reginald Shepard, and also just edited How We Do It, a very important volume about pedagogy. And I'm always telling my students that being a writer, it's fun to do your own writing, and it's very rewarding and fulfilling to bring your work into the world, but that has really nothing to do with literary community. Can you talk a little bit about like the literary citizenship of putting these together? This is amazingly strenuous work to put volumes like this together. What was that like?
Well, in both cases, I really wanted to make books that I wanted to see in the world that I didn't think existed. And I was really happy to have the opportunity. I think of my poems this way. When I'm writing my poems, I want to make, I mean, one of the ways I think about revision, one of the ways I think about putting a book together is knowing that I have made something that I've never seen before, and knowing that I have made something that I myself, and in particular, the 18-year-old version of me, but that I myself would want to read, or that I myself, when I was a young reader, I very distinctly remember being in libraries and being in bookstores and being very impressed by the writing that I would read, and yet having a feeling of wanting something more, of a feeling, and I think maybe every writer feels this way, even if we're not aware of articulating it in that way, that part of what we're doing when we write is we're making what isn't yet there.
Absolutely.
We're adding to that conversation. And so those two books, the Reginald Shepard selected, I was so happy I got to do, because he's been such an important poet to me. He's my favorite poet to fight with. He does things. He's done things, and he did things in his work that I've never gotten over. I still read his blog, which is still posted in case anybody wants to read it.
He's been gone since 2008.
Yes.
So this is a haunted blog.
And I remember, and I met him one time. I only got to meet him once. And when I did, it was really, like there's certain hands you're just happy to shake. And I was really happy to shake his hand. And I disagreed with him about a lot of things, and I agreed with him about a lot of things, but I never doubted his genius. And so I was happy to do the selected because it seemed to me an opportunity to reintroduce that genius to our community.
Yeah.
And in the case of how we do it, writing a craft book full of Black writers is something that I hadn't seen before. I mean, I've seen all kinds of Black essay collections, but in particular, putting together people from Barry Jenkins to T.R.E. Jones to Daniel Black, putting those voices in the same space, Terrence Hayes, Natasha Trethewey, putting those, Rita Dove, putting those voices in the same space seemed to me to offer a kind of education that I would have wanted as a young writer. And so I think, so that's my answer.
Yeah. It sounds like both of these projects meet you at the age of like 19 or something.
Yeah.
That we were just back in the green room talking about what fun it was to be first book poets. There's different things in life happen when you're on your third and fourth book. And just that incredible, exhilarating energy of entering a community and we still do this, but you have to work harder for it. I'm just full of curiosity and questions about what am I going to do next. You're just different at that age.
Yeah.
You must have had an opportunity to connect with old friends when you were doing How We Do It.
Yes and no. I had an opportunity to connect with old friends through their writing, but one of the reasons I believe so deeply in the book, one of the reasons that I love the book so much, and I really love how it turned out, is because I would have notes on essays. I would have edits, but I never had to contact anybody about the edits. There was a go-between. And because originally when I was asked to do the book, I was asked by the Hurston Wright Foundation and Howard University, and I didn't want to do it because I was busy enough. And but when they said what they wanted to do, and I knew I had that idea, there was this thing that happens, which is the reason why I do a lot of things that I do. And it was simply that if I didn't do it, they were going to call somebody else. And I couldn't manage who they were going to call.
and I kept
thinking, oh no, they'll call Greg Partlow. Do you know? No, it's a joke. Y'all didn't even laugh. Y'all really hate Greg Partlow. Anyway, so I kept thinking, I don't know who they're going to call to do this, and I don't want them to call somebody, and then there's this book in the world that I would rather not exist. So I had to take advantage.
It's getting better.
So I had to take advantage of that. I mean, it's the kind of thing I would have done further down the line, I think. The same thing with the Reginald Shepard.
Yeah, did they come to you with, do you want to edit the selected Shepard, or did you say, do you want to edit? I want to do Shepard.
Terrence called me on the phone, and it's sort of this kind of weird secret that Terrence Hayes is the editor of the Pitt Poetry Press.
It says it on the first page.
It says it on the first page, but you don't hear people anyway.
Well, that's what I mean about literary citizenship. The great poets are not sitting around waiting for their phone call from the New Yorker to publish the next poem.
Exactly.
They are working really hard for the community.
Yeah. So when he asked me to do it, when he asked me, he said, hey, did you want to, I have this thing that we want to do, and I think you already said you wanted to do it. And he remembered what happened was he was interacting with Ocean Vuong. This must have happened, this had to happen 15 years ago.
That's how
and
long
Ocean Vuong mentioned to him that 15 years ago, when Ocean Vuong was still in graduate school, that I had said I wanted to do the selected Shepard. And Terrence called me on the phone and asked me to do it, and I said yes. And so I was very happy to do it.
That is really beautiful.
And I was really excited to have Reginald Shepard's poems all over my house, although I think I got a little bit of a haunting.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, for a little while I was like, okay, bro, it's time for you to get out of here.
Well, I think that it sounds like the way you were describing it, he haunting you as a voice that you wanted to contradict sometimes too.
Yes.
But the introduction, you mention a couple of things about his work that also resonate with your work.
Yes.
I know when you met him, you couldn't have written Please yet. What year did
No.
Did he even know you were a poet? He couldn't have known you were going to be you. But
Well,
everyone knew that when you were like 3.
He knew I was a poet, and he was very aware. You know, when I met him, I met him on a panel that he had put together of queer poets. And I think the panel, by the way, might have been called something like "Who's Your Daddy?" But I could, which will give you an example of Reginald Shepard, right? That was the occasion upon which I shook his hand. I remember James Allen Hall and many other poets who I admire were on that panel, and I very distinctly remember that his interaction with them, and he was a big reader, so there's a way that I didn't have a book yet, so he didn't know me in that way, but he had seen my poems around, and he made that clear to me.
He wouldn't have been on this panel.
Yeah, he knew. I mean, he was doing what we do. He was checking out the literary journals to see what the new stuff was, you know? So
I hope that panel was recorded.
I hope so too.
Somebody's going to look for that.
I hope so
I
too.
want to name the panel that we're doing right now called "Who's Your Mommy?"
Okay, I like that.
Because you talk in the introduction about some of the things that you admire or that you notice as through lines in his work. His erotic poems in particular, his interest in mythology. And then I think you say, but everybody writes about those things.
Yeah.
And then you say it's also his interest in his mother. That there are amazing, beautiful poems about Shepard's mother that run through his whole career. Somebody he lost when he was young, a teenager, I think. But there's mothers in a mother. Sometimes a mother figure, but sometimes I think maybe your mother in your work too. In turning 26 from Please, now I'm looking at my notes, you write, "You remember me pushing shoulder first out of your body into a spiral of birthdays and bruises." An amazing poem in a first book too, because it's a poem, of course, about being born, but it's this emergent book as well. And in the New Testament, you have Nativity and Motherland, which are unusual mother poems in that they are metaphoric mothers. There's a through line, I know you all know this work. In the New Testament, there is a sort of metaphoric brother. There's a conceit of a character who is a brother and isn't a brother by blood. So if there's a metaphoric brother, there must be a metaphoric mother as well. But it's really your newest book that has the most emotional of the mother poems. It feels like you're tapping into your mother in a very different way. Of course, 4 Day in the Morning is the most moving poem I've ever read about a mother, probably.
So sweet. Thank you.
I heard you read it live somewhere. I don't remember where we were. And I got home and called my mother and read it to her.
Oh, wow.
And I said, "I actually know this poet." And she was like, "Wow, you must be important."
I appreciate that, Robyn. Thank you.
But it's also as a human being, I think, that sets up a lot of the themes in the book. Would you read us that poem?
Yes.
Would you be comfortable reading that
I'll
one?
read it.
Okay. I marked it. It's page.
I mean, I got to charge y'all more if I read poems. I don't know why they laughing. We're going to pass a hat. All right. As a human being, there is the happiness you have and the happiness you deserve. They sit apart from each other the way you and your mother sat on opposite ends of the sofa after an ambulance came to take your father away. Some good doctor will stitch him up, and soon an aunt will arrive to drive your mother to the hospital where she will settle next to him forever, as promised. She holds the arm of her seat as if she could fall, as if it is the only sturdy thing, and it is, since you've done what you always wanted. You fought your father and won, marred him. He'll have a scar he can see, all because of you. and your mother, the only woman you ever cried for, must tend to it as a bride tends to her vows, forsaking all others, no matter how sore the injury. No matter how sore the injury has left you, you sit understanding yourself as a human being, finally free now that nobody's got to love you.
Thank you so much. I'm embarrassed that you just saw my marginalia there, probably. Can you tell us a little bit about having written that in the second person?
There's I think this started in my first book. The very first poem is a poem in second person, um, almost even surprisingly in second person, because there's a way that it's a poem called Lush Life, track one, Lush Life. And in that
Looking for the
poem,
book. Okay, we'll look at it later.
there's a way that in poetry, and y'all know this, that you can make use of the colloquials such that you say you but seem to mean I. And in that poem, the poem moves forward with me saying you, but by the end of the poem, it is clear that when I say you, I mean the reader, and that there is an I writing the poem. And I think that original impulse in my first book and then throughout my work after that had to do with me imagining a hostile reader. And I was imagining that hostile reader because I was imagining, first and foremost, a reader who would not be able to accept that the material that they were reading was queer material, and a reader who would not be able to accept or might not be able to accept that the reader that they were reading, that the material that they were reading was Black material. And I wanted oh so much to be able to, if I encountered that reader, have a very open fight with that reader. And I realized that part of what I was doing in those early poems and then trying to subvert in my last book was fighting someone who must have been in me, fighting a certain kind of I don't have a better word for it other than self-hatred, although I've always had a good time being Black and queer. But that's the only word that I have for it. This part of me that sort of tiptoed around certain things and around certain instances of life, and was always rhetorically trying to find ways that I could understand that everybody else would understand that I was okay. And so I think that poem and many other poems that I've written appear in the second person, because in that particular case, because that you really is me. And sometimes there's an opportunity for me to say you and really fight with myself, sometimes even beat myself up about the ways in which I can rhetorically tiptoe around race and around sexuality. And what I don't know what I managed in my last book, but what I managed for me was finally not tiptoeing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And that was really for me, that was really the achievement of that particular book. I felt in a very different way tied to the Black community and the queer community all at once. And I felt that I could use that for a book which I really thought was going to be a kind of protest book about about the natural world and the environment, but ended up, according to readers, being a protest book about police. So,
there.
which I mean, that's how things turn out. I guess I can't make critics say what I want them to say. So, so that was, I mean, and that's another thing that I think of myself as having in common with a writer like Shepard. Shepard is really an eco-poet in many ways. He's a poet interested in the natural world and the preservation of the natural world. So I think that's where that you in that poem appears, but there's a great use of second person in all of my work. And I had to write that book to figure out why.
Yeah. Do you think that by saying in this particular poem, by saying you instead of I, there's this self-preservation of the natural world, but it's of the self, like it's something different, that it's by, I don't know, there's something almost uncanny by not saying I, but using some other person, that things may come up that one didn't know, one thought, right? That one is hiding from the eye in some ways.
I think if that poem, I think saying there is the happiness, well, I'll say this. I remember very distinctly how that poem appeared. It's very different. You only get so many poems like this. I don't like talking about this because I don't like to give, there's a possibility of students in the audience, in any audience, and I don't like to give the wrong impression about how poems get written. Every once in a while, you get a poem. And this was one of those times that I got a poem. As a matter of fact, I remember sitting on my couch and I was sitting next to and across from my students because we had created this time in my living room where we would write. And and in that moment that they were also, at that time I was judging. I was on the jury for the National Book Award, and all of the books were coming to my house. So they would come and they would look through the books, and then there was a period of time after looking through the books that they would also write, and I would write with them. We were sort of reading together, and they were helping me choose what my top picks would be for the National Book Award.
What a great class!
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I wish I could judge the National Book Award every year. It's a lot of free books, and then you get to give away a lot of books too. Anyway. So, and for whatever reason, that day I had those lines, and those are the lines I started with, and that last line is the last line I ended with, and I did some revision, but not a lot. And I think because I started with second person, I stayed in second person. But to answer your question, I don't think I would have been able to write about having a physical altercation with my very real father if I was saying I
No way.
in a poem.
No.
Yeah.
And nobody gets a poem for nothing. You put in years of craft work
Yes.
so that you can have that moment, so that it comes when you need it. And then you put the pressure on again in the next poem.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So was there ever a moment in the revision process where you thought, I'll change the you to I?
No. There was something about, the poem in my mind, because I got to that moment that is about an altercation, I understood the poem to be about a fight. And it's important to me that the form of the poem, the structure of the poem, and the subject of the poem all have something to do with one another. And because the poem is about a fight, the speaker of the poem should be saying you, right? There's a way that for me at least, that already creates a my side and a your side in the very point of view, in the very makings of the poem. And when I'm revising, that's usually what I'm revising toward. I'm not trying to revise experiences into or out of a poem. Experiences might enter a poem or leave a poem, but only because they're not matching the form and content. I want the form and the content to have everything to do with each other, such that you can't imagine reading the poem in another form, or such that you can imagine reading the subject in another form, or imagine another form for a different subject. Do you see?
Absolutely. And it's the trick to self, too. You have to not be able to imagine what you would say in order to pull off saying it.
Exactly.
You know what's kind of an amazing moment in reading that poem is that you use the word marred. Mm-hmm. And I had noted reading this poem many times that there's no lyric I in the poem. There's this you. The word marred, almost every time I read it, I say married in my mind's voice. And if it's married, it's a very Freudian reading. And that works too, in a way. And the mother, you use the word bride in the poem. I'm not wrong to see the word married behind the word marred. But the word marred is basically married without the I.
Right.
And this poem, so the poem is missing the I, that word is missing the I, and that reading attention gives me permission to understand the poem in another way.
Well, the poem is very Oedipal. When my parents appear in my poem, I am making use of, the archetypes, the structures that have already existed before. And so I would think, I don't know, anyone reading the poems who has also read Oedipus would probably see that playing out. And that plays out in that way because I have it.
Yeah.
And I think we should be using whatever structures, whatever archetypes we have in order to make our poems all that they can be.
Totally. But I think that is, I'm guessing here, was that one of the gifts of the poem? I can't imagine you sat down and said, I'm going to write the word marred because if I put an I in it, it would be married. And I'm not going to use the lyric I. That just happens, right? That's being in the zone.
Yeah, except I did
Okay.
change that word to marred.
Aha,
I mean,
okay.
that's one of the few changes in the poem.
And what was the word before?
I don't remember.
Well, I'm glad we found
I did.
it.
I mean, I do remember changing it to marred. And the reason I remember changing it to marred is because of all that you just, like, I wanted. Also, often I find in my poems that there are certain changes or shifts in diction. And part of the reason why that happens is because they're poems. And I don't think that poems actually sound like grocery store. There's a kind of chat you have with the person in line with you at the grocery store. I just don't want my poems to sound like that. I think, I know there's
I want to go to that grocery store where that chat sounds like that, though.
There's this thing about like poetry sounding, people think of accessibility equaling talk. And if there's one thing I hate in poetry is talk. Oh, when I'm reading a poem and people start sounding like they're talking, I just shake my head.
That's what you start singing in your poems.
Yes, yeah, because that's what they are.
Yeah,
that's what lyric means.
That's a perfect segue for me to ask you about repetition.
Please.
So there's almost no point in your poems where I ever think you're just talking, if there were any such thing as just talking anyway. But you very much remind me I am in a made space, an aestheticized, very singing space. Every time you repeat something, it feels organic. It needs to be said twice, but I also know that I'm part of a congregation saying it twice. It feels like a call and response. There's a particular kind of repetition that he's already laughing. There's a particular kind of repetition that you pull off a lot in this book. And it's the repetition of the end of a phrase, for instance, forsaking all others, no matter how sore the injury, period. No matter how sore the injury has left you, you sit. Okay, I had to look this up because the professor in me would not allow me to just notice that and not know the name for it. And I discovered that it's called anadiplosis.
It sounds like bad sex.
And it is specifically the repetition of the end of one phrase as the beginning of another. It comes from Greek folding over. And then you use this many times in this book. In The Hero, you say, she cried when she whipped me daily. In The Water Lilies, themselves aspirational beings, fake if you ask me. If you ask me, I'll say no. In The Shovel, tie it like a proper gift. A gift a good child will give up on opening. Those are just three when I was like, let me see if I can find some more of that. And then it becomes an engine under the duplex that those of you who've read this book know that there is an invented form in this book that is called the duplex. And this is just an opening for you to talk a little bit about repetition. It's obviously so important to you.
I'm so glad you see those things. You should write an essay.
Did.
Yeah, there's something, let me just say this, how you move when you don't know what you're going to say next in a poem is often, I think for any poet, that you just figure out what you said last and push.
Yeah, some people edit that out, but for you...
And sometimes that does get edited out, and sometimes it stays. And I'm very aware of it in this book and in books from the past, And so what I like to think of it as a strategy that allows for a sense of song in the poems. And that's, because repetition creates a sense of song. AJ Verdale says that repetition is holy, which I believe. One of the reasons I believe that is because when I'm in the midst of dire circumstances, I will say, or I will whisper to myself, come on, Jericho. Jericho, come on. Do you know what I mean? And that's a prayer.
That's chiasmus.
That's a prayer that I'm making to myself. And that, in our chanting, in our praying, in our singing, we are always making use of repetition with the idea that if we repeat something enough, we begin to transcend it, right? That we get on the other
Absolutely.
side of it by repeating it.
That's beautiful.
So I would say that that's part of the reason why that's there. I am so glad that you have noticed it. Though it feels funny to have that kind of thing noticed. This is the kind of work that I do in my class, which you just did, and it makes me so happy. Because then what I would tell students is when you write your next poem, try to do that. And that's how I think that's how you actually read poems. You sort of notice the strategies that poets are making use of. I mean, if you're a poet, that's how you read poems. You notice the strategies that poets are making use of, and then you can deploy those same strategies in your own work. And I will say that, yes, because I was doing that, it was natural for me to make use of that formally when I was inventing the duplex, which is probably the most ecstatic experience I have ever had writing poetry. I wish, I get emotional. Like I wish I was still writing. I am writing duplexes, but the first time that I was writing duplexes, I have never been so happy in my whole life.
So you wrote one, and then did you know immediately, I have to do this again?
Yes. Well, it's because of how I wrote one. I wrote the first duplex using scraps, I literally cut up every line I had ever written that was 9 to 11 syllables long.
He's also a syllabicist.
Yeah, I am. Like somebody else I know sitting up here. I am a syllabicist, and it's deep, but it's deep because I am interested in Eastern forms, and I am interested in how those Eastern forms can intermingle with Western meter, and how do I get meter to intermingle with syllabics, and I manage iambic pentameter through 9 to 11 syllables, which doesn't happen every time, but happens a lot.
Well, sometimes the opposite of it happens. And you usually get tetrameter, let's be
Yes.
honest.
Yes.
And is it the first poem?
I naturally write in I was just talking to my friend Michael, who reads all of my poems, Michael Shoemaker. My readers are people like Michael Shoemaker and Michael Dumanis. If your name's Michael, you get to read all my poems before they're done.
Change your name.
And both Michaels have always said, like, what's up with you in the tetrameter, Jericho? And what's up with me in the tetrameter is just that it is my natural line.
Yeah, this is clear in the tradition, but the natural line, it seems like you're pushing against iambic pentameter, because the whole book starts, the first line of this book is, a man trades his son for horses. And a man is iambic, but trades his is not. That's a trochaic inversion. Son for is trochaic, horses is trochaic. And it seems to me a radical act and a huge comment on the tradition that you would open the book with one iambic foot and then reverse it. And this is a poem about a book about reversing really everything, about claiming the tradition and making it into something else. And in the first poem is about this presumption that violence can be erased by calling it something else.
Yes.
So it has to come across backward in its way.
Yes.
But I want to go back to the duplex.
Sure. Oh, I had cut up all of these slivers of paper in order to make this poem that was in my mind. And I doubted that I could make it work because I do not believe you should put a form before, for instance, I'll say it this way. When I'm writing a pantoum or a villanelle or a sonnet, it's because whatever writing I'm doing seems to lean toward that direction. I don't sit down thinking, oh, and now I'm going to write a villanelle. Actually, what happens is I notice myself repeating lines, and then I say, oh, maybe this should be a villanelle, which is different. I mean, I have to know what a villanelle is.
Right.
in
And that's
order
where
to do
all
that.
the work comes in so that you can have these
Exactly.
moments in the zone.
In this particular case, when I was making the duplexes, I figured out in my head exactly what I wanted the form to be. And because I figured that out, just figuring out a form doesn't give you a poem. And so I used the lines that I already had in failed poems and in the notes app of my iPhone and on old computers. And I did that because I wanted to make one poem. And after I made that one poem, I looked around at this. I mean, because it's actually only 7 lines. I mean, it's 14 lines, but you only need 7 to make it.
Oh, that's such a good trick. I hadn't really thought of that.
So then that meant I had hundreds of lines sitting over here that were left. And I was like, well, that was fun. I should try and do it again.
Well, I love that I'm understanding that these pieces of paper are like all over the house on the floor. And I think I read that maybe that started that way. And you say repetition is holy. It also seems like it's really uncanny right now that you made an engine for repetition in the duplex. So there are rules about when they repeat and how. But if it's old lines, it's repeated too. It's like its first iteration in a poem is already a repetition.
Yeah.
Repetition is holy, repetition is prayer, but it's also haunting.
Yes.
And I think it's also kind of PTSD.
Yes.
Like, yes, we want to repeat something and transcend it and get it out, but don't we also repeat our memories? And
Yes.
it's uncontrollable?
Yes.
It feels like there are poems in this book in which the repetition is not controlled. There might be a word for it. There's a rhetorical device, but that doesn't mean it's under any control because it just comes up uncannily into the house. This might be a book about the environment. It's also very much a domestic book. Mm-hmm. But when it is planned in the duplex, there is a presumption of somehow understanding it, of being able to control that repetition. And the book really moves, and it doesn't progress. It goes back and forth between, I don't know what I'm going to say next. I've just repeated something and I didn't know I meant that, in this deep lyric discovery, and trying to plan something, which also has its lyric discovery. But what's important to me, I think, is thinking about both of these things, being in this house of the self and seeing the self come back in these different kinds of iterations.
It's just important to me that I feel surprised while I'm in the midst of writing. When I was getting my PhD at the University of Houston, back when our computers didn't move, I had over the space where I would write a banner that said, "Every line a surprise." And what became important to me when I was writing my first book, for instance, though I wouldn't have called it writing my first book. I mean, at the time I was just
called writing poems.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a poem so I could have something to turn in for workshop, and Claudia Rankin wouldn't be looking at me like I was crazy. But at that time, I just kept thinking, oh, I wrote a line, and now I know what I would say next, but I don't want to say that. I want to say something even I don't expect to say next. And so that sort of always jolted me back, such that every time I wrote a line, I was in a spirit of surprise. And if I could keep myself in that spirit, I would be able to trust that a reader would be. And often that would mean writing a first draft that didn't make what people call sense.
Of course.
But then I can revise, and I'm not so interested in sense.
There's a lot of ways to make sense.
Yeah, sense is,
Yeah, it's
sense is kind of overrated.
That's right.
I mean, you know what I mean by that.
Sensorium is not overrated, but the sensorium is underrated.
The sensorium is not overrated.
it's amazing to think about using repetition as surprise too, because your work and great repetition, it's not the same thing uttered. It has to change somehow. How it's sitting in, which is where we get back to anadiplosis. Anadiplosis?
Yes, anadiplosis. That's what it is.
Because if it's you're starting a new thought with those words, the duplex magically opens with the same poem that it closes with.
Yeah.
So you know when you start that poem where you're going to go, and it's nowhere and everywhere, and I think that's kind of a domestic pacing too. To me, it's not claustrophobic; it's transcendent, but we're in the same place. That's how I know I'm in a haunted house. And it reminded me, and you're somebody else who has invented forms and blended forms, is Gwendolyn Brooks, and the sonnet ballad, which she named sonnet ballad. As somebody else may have named a poem after the form duplex. The sonnet, the ballad, the blues, guzzles, and maybe some pantoum in there too. But anyway, the sonnet ballad by Brooks starts with the line, "Oh, mother, mother." I told you this was going to be about mothers. "Oh, mother, mother, where is happiness?" And guess what the last line is?
Oh, mother, mother.
Where is happiness?
Where is happiness?
I don't think this audience would forgive me if we bring you to Chicago and you don't tell us a little bit about how much Gwendolyn Brooks has meant to you.
Wow, Robyn, you want me to cry. I met Gwendolyn Brooks. I met Gwendolyn Brooks when I was 22 years old. And I mean, some of the people in this room probably met Gwendolyn Brooks, and so you know that there was something.
All those people nodding. That's amazing.
Yeah, you know that there was something in her that came out of her, even without her speaking. And to this day, she remains the kindest person I've ever met in my entire life. She was like an angel. She came to read at my undergraduate school, Dillard University, a black school in New Orleans, Louisiana. And during the reading, she gave a brilliant reading. I remember when she was reading, I had to sit behind her. So I didn't actually see the reading, I only heard it. And then afterward, she signed books for, I think, about 2 hours. The line for her book signing went around the chapel where she read. So it was hard to tell where the beginning of the line was. Thank you. And but it was really a wonderful thing to see as a very young person, and as a very young person who wanted to be a writer. She had so much meaning. I mean, her very presence had so much meaning for that community. People had been telling me, that nobody reads poetry, and yet the entirety of New Orleans had come to see Gwendolyn Brooks read poems. And you could see people walking away bragging about having done it. You know what I mean? Like they were leaving the reading like, we saw Gwendolyn Brooks. Do you know what I'm saying? And so because I was in a position where people thought I was smart, after the reading, I was going to go have dinner with Gwendolyn Brooks, as well as some other people, and from the campus. And well, let me say this before I get to the dinner. She had signed all these books, and as we were walking out of the chapel, she stopped in the threshold, and she turned around and she said, "We are leaving. Is there anything else for me to sign?" She wanted to make sure everybody got everything signed. So then we get to this restaurant, very famous restaurant in New Orleans, Dookie Chase. And we were late, of course, because she had spent so much time signing books. The restaurant had actually just closed. But we made it into the door, and we had a reservation, but that was moot at that point. And my teacher, the poet Mona Lisa Saloy, said, "Hey, we got Gwendolyn Brooks here, and we really need a meal for her." And the person at the front said, "I don't know what to tell you. We are closed." And he said, "Give me a second." And he went to the back, and when he came back, he was with Leah Chase, who is probably the the greatest cook who ever lived. Anyway, he came back with Leah Chase, and Leah Chase in front of me, and Gwendolyn Brooks was sitting in a chair waiting very quietly, as if these things weren't happening. And Leah Chase proceeded to cuss Mona Lisa Saloy out. And because she had brought Gwendolyn Brooks to her restaurant and hadn't told her that Gwendolyn Brooks was coming. And she told her very directly, "We are always open for Gwendolyn Brooks." And she said, "If you ever have Gwendolyn Brooks come here and you don't tell me, I will fight you." She said, I'll never forget that. Rest her soul. And then, we sat to eat, and there was sort of a seating arrangement that people had in mind. And Gwendolyn Brooks said, "I just want to sit next to the students." And so she sat with me on one side and another student on another side. And when we sat down, she started talking to me. Well, first, she asked me, the first thing she said to me was, she asked me my name. I told her my name. And she said, "So what is your conception of the line?"
What?
And,
You better have an answer.
and I said, "What?" And she said, "Your conception of the line." And I said, "Ma'am, I don't know if I have a conception." And she said, "Oh, well, you probably just have to think about what you've been reading. Have you read the new anthology, the new African American literature anthology from Henry Louis Gates?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I have not." And she said, "Oh, well, I'm sure it's on your list." There's been all kinds of talk about it because, he leaves out and she tells me who's not in the anthology, and she tells me who's in the anthology.
This is how you learned how to gossip about poetry.
I mean, this is how I learned that I should be able to. Do you know what I mean? And the other thing she started doing was telling me people's conception of the line who were in the book. The most important part, and the night went on with her asking me very difficult questions. I think I was 19 or 20. I said 22 earlier, but I think I was 19 or 20 years old, because I would have been a junior or a sophomore or a junior. And she said, so the night ended. And a week later, probably less than a week later, at that time you would go, there was this thing called mail. And you would go, if you went to school on a college campus, everybody got their mail in the same place. And so you would go to that, usually in the student center or student union, and you would go that place and unlock. And if you were, and I never had mail, but I checked it every day because that's just what you did. And I had a slip of paper in my mail that suggested that I had a package, and I never got a package. And and people would see that you had this slip. And I remember checking my mail, and people around me said, "Nelson, you got a package." And whenever anybody, my school was pretty small, so when people had a package, other people would gather around because they wanted to know what the package was. So I got this package, and I opened it then and there, and it was that African American anthology of literature, edited by Henry Louis Gates, signed by Gwendolyn Brooks. And I read that. That thing was this thick. And do you know I read it in 10 days? I read that book, baby, because I was going to find out what everybody's conception of the line was. And if I was not, and I was always, I was trying to write. I was always a bit of a reader. But I think that's really the occasion of my life that made me a reader and made me understand what I was doing when I was when I'm in community with poets, and what I am doing as a teacher. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I understand why you said angel now. She blessed you.
Yes, it was just I mean, every day, I don't know what I'm doing, but I just always hope, like, if I could do that if I could do what she did for anybody, I would be glad to go. You know what I'm saying? Like, and then the wonderful thing about Gwendolyn Brooks is that anybody who has a Gwendolyn Brooks story tells that story. There is, like, every time I hear people talk about, and y'all know this because this is Chicago, when people tell you their Gwendolyn Brooks story, you always be like, whoa! Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway, that's it. She's very important to me, and I love her poems. I'd already been reading her poems because you couldn't get around them. And I was living in a city. I thank God that I was living in New Orleans at the time because I didn't have this idea. I didn't grow up with this idea of poetry as a marginalized literature because it was in the church where I grew up, right along with a 14-year-old reciting. I grew up at a time where if you were a young person, if you were a child, when I was growing up, you weren't really, there's this thing now where it's okay, but you weren't allowed to be shy. And because I grew up in the Black church, there was a reason to trot young people in front of the church once a month. There was always a speech to give or a play or a pageant and so very young people, like 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, would say a few words that they would have had memorized. And after they would do that, everybody in the church would scream. And in some cases, roll around on the floor. And that kind of thing seemed to me what the power of the word was. So people would be reciting scriptures, but you would see, a 10-year-old girl reciting Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou, or a 10-year-old boy reciting Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, or a young person reciting Ego Trippin' by Nikki Giovanni, or any number of things by James Weldon Johnson and Paul Laurence Dunbar. That was a part of the way I grew up. So I had no idea that people weren't reading poems. It looked like they were reading them to me. And then when I moved to New Orleans, because there were so many Black people, the poets that I encountered were Black. And the history of poetry that I was getting from them was a history of Black poetry. Do you know what I'm saying? So I grew up knowing about, I became a poet knowing about the last poets, as if the last poets were anybody else a poet. They weren't like, I didn't think of them as someone you had to discover under a rock.
And when this anthology came, it must have been full of old friends, too.
Exactly. So anyway, yes, her work has been very important to me. And it's also been very important when I think about making use of form and making form my own. You know this because I know you make use of this poem, the Beverly Hills poem that I'm not getting the right title for. But Beverly
That's
Hills,
right,
Chicago,
thank you.
thank you so much. She was always making use of form, but also at the same time subverting it,
Absolutely.
which seemed to me my responsibility, that I should know form, and knowing it would mean rebelling against it inside of it. Do you understand what I mean?
Of course, she's breaking form even as she is proving its use.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, and I read like
As are
Gay
you.
Chaps at the Bar when I was very young, and I was just like, this thing is still going. Do you know what I mean?
course
Like,
I
how do
do.
you do that? And I wanted to know, and I still do. I wanted to know how she did some of the things she did. Gwendolyn Brooks has some of the most beautiful love poems out there. She was not a school marm of a poet. There's
Why
some
does she
erotic
have
stuff going
that
on.
reputation?
I don't know what
I
that's
have
about.
no idea.
But and that was all very inspiring for me, and remains in many ways the bar for me in terms of my writing, but also in terms of my personhood in a world of poets. Yeah.
I'm glad I asked.
I'm glad you asked too.